He walked through a valley where the air felt heavy, as if every memory he carried pressed against his chest. Forgiving seemed impossible, a task meant for saints or fools. Yet a quiet voice echoed through the mist, ancient and steady, calling him to something he feared. Forgive 70 times 7. He froze, breath stolen by the weight of those words. 70 times 7 was not a number he could count, but a doorway into places he avoided for years. Behind it lived wounds he kept locked, convinced they were safer in the dark. But the voice pursued, gentle yet unyielding, slipping through the cracks of his defenses like light searching a sealed room. And as the valley tightened around him, that phrase became a mirror he could no longer ignore. Perhaps the greatest prison was not what others had done to him, but his refusal to release them. And in that moment, between fog and sorrow, he knew he had to discover what Jesus truly meant. Just as he gathered the courage to take another step, a chill swept through his mind, as if the past itself had risen to confront him. And before he could run, the same piercing words returned, cutting deeper than any memory he tried to bury. He walked as though crossing an invisible courtroom. Every memory rose like an accuser, pointing to harsh words, betrayals, broken promises. In his heart, he kept a quiet list of names he swore he would never forgive. Yet the phrase returned again and again, striking the stone of his pride with relentless force. Forgive 70 times 7. Not poetry, but a death sentence for the right to hold a grudge. As he moved deeper into the valley, he felt observed. These were not just memories. It was as though heaven itself weighed his steps. In his mind appeared a fisherman approaching Jesus with a sincere question. How many times should someone be forgiven? He imagined Peter's face, hoping for a reasonable limit, something that would protect dignity while preserving the right to stop loving. Then he saw, by faith, the Master's answer. It was not a number to record, but an explosion against the arithmetic of revenge. 70 times 7 was not an equation, but a key breaking ancient locks. As if Jesus declared that true forgiveness keeps no ledger, collects no offenses, and refuses the secret joy of finally saying enough. It was a command to abandon the cold economics of resentment. Hearing this within, the man felt revolt. Forgive without limit. What about the words that wounded him as a child? What about the betrayal that shattered his trust? Should all of that simply be erased? The valley tightened around him, as if God himself pushed him toward truth. Forgiveness was not about the other person. It was about the kind of man he was becoming. Another scene formed. A great king sat upon a throne, calling servants to settle accounts. One man was brought with a debt so impossible that no lifetime could repay it. It was absurd, crushing, hopeless. He knew judgment was certain, and nothing could save him. His guilt was too large, and his ability too small. Despair was all he had left. But the king, moved by compassion, cancelled the debt completely. Not reduced, not negotiated, not delayed. Erased. The traveler saw in this the reflection of God's grace. Each of us carries a guilt before the Lord greater than our strength, heavier than our lifetime. Every dark thought, every hidden sin forms a mountain of debt. Yet God offers full pardon through Christ. The man felt a painful realization. He wanted God's forgiveness for his own impossible debt, yet clung fiercely to the small debts of others. Like the forgiven servant who hunted down someone who owed far less, he allowed the river of grace to stop with him. Grace that does not flow becomes stagnant. Mercy received, but not given, turns sour. He watched the forgiven servant seize his fellow man, demanding immediate payment. The scene suffocated him, the hands gripping a throat, the heart hardened, the sudden amnesia of the mercy just received. The problem was not explanation, but transformation. To taste infinite forgiveness and still refuse to forgive reveals a heart untouched by grace. The story continued. The king learned of the servant's cruelty and summoned him, not as a friend, but as one who wasted mercy. The pardon was withdrawn, and he was handed over to tormentors. He could never pay. It was a portrait of a soul that refuses forgiveness, not punished for the offense, but for rejecting the mercy meant to change him. The traveler trembled. Forgiveness was not optional, not an accessory for the overly spiritual. It was evidence that God's grace had truly reached the roots of the soul. Without it, a person remains a captive, singing songs but living in unseen chains. Jesus treated forgiveness as a test of true discipleship. A tree without this fruit suggests no life in the roots. He tried to justify himself, but what they did was serious. Someone must pay. Yet he sensed that what he called justice was often revenge in disguise. A wounded heart becomes its own judge and executioner, but in sentencing others he imprisoned himself. The bitterness he thought he managed was the very cell that held him. The valley quieted further. He realized that by repeating offenses, replaying conversations, nursing fantasies of vindication, he returned voluntarily to a prison he claimed to hate. The injustice he suffered was real, but now he was committing another, refusing to resemble the God who forgave him freely. It was like rejecting the very hand that lifted him. His thoughts shifted to Calvary. An innocent man hung on wood, bearing guilt not his own, blood dripping, mockery echoing, yet from his lips came words of mercy for his executioners. There was the standard of heaven. Not forgiveness that ignores pain, but forgiveness that bleeds. Forgiveness that endures fire and still refuses to repay evil with evil. Deep down, he always wanted forgiveness without the cross. Her God who erased his sins without exposing his pride, but 70 times 7 demanded the crucifixion of vengeance itself, a call to let the cross pierce his relationships, unclenching the fist that clung to grudges. Forgiveness was not sentimental, it was sacrificial. He saw now that forgiving 70 times 7 was not weakness, but freedom. As long as he kept chains on another's neck, he failed to notice the other end wrapped around his own soul. Each refusal tightened the knot. Forgiveness did not minimize injustice. It broke its power to define him. It opened his own cell. Tears returned. Names surfaced in his mind, faces he avoided even in prayer. He realized he spoke many words to God, but seldom brought him his enemies. He feared what God might ask. Now he understood why. 70 times 7 was not meant for small offenses alone, but for the deep chasms of the heart. The valley brightened slightly. Rocks, roots, and shadows came into view, as if light crept in. He realized that by insisting forgiveness was impossible, he remained stuck in the same place year after year. His story froze, his relationships stalled, his prayers hit an invisible ceiling. Bitterness was the stone blocking his way. Then came the deepest realization. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting or enabling. It meant surrendering final judgment to God, trusting divine justice over personal revenge, becoming like the king who cancelled his impossible debt instead of the servant who chose a chokehold over humility. At the end of the path, a door seemed to open before him, not of emotion, but of obedience. 70 times 7 was no longer a phrase to admire, but a calling to live. The real question was no longer what others did to him, but what God had done for him through Christ. And that answer changed everything. If this story touched your heart, comment your favorite lesson below. The man inhaled deeply as he entered a new stretch of the valley, narrower and quieter than before. There was no wind, no echo, only the steady pulse of his own heart announcing an inner battle. He knew this part was not about memories, but choices. Forgiveness was no longer an idea discussed from a distance, but a narrow path where each step demanded surrender. Heaven seemed to watch, waiting for the decision that would shape his future. As he walked, the weight of his stories pressed on him. These were not just old wounds, but narratives he rehearsed so often that they became part of his identity. Every offense had become a brick in a fortress built around his soul. And now, in this sacred silence, the Spirit began dismantling what he had spent years constructing. Each memory asked to be examined under the light of what Christ had done for him. He saw himself in the mirror of the unforgiving servant. Though he resisted admitting it, he sometimes used the failures of others as a shield to keep distance, to avoid new wounds. A hurt heart creates complex systems to prevent further pain. Yet these same systems isolate and imprison. The valley shifted like a moving mirror, exposing layers of pride and fear he had never named. He wanted to argue again, Some people truly didn't deserve forgiveness, but when he compared that thought with the immeasurable mercy God had shown him, the absurdity became clear. Forgiveness was not about merit, but about grace. Grace is a river meant to flow. If he dammed it up, it turned stagnant. The moment mercy stops moving, it stops being mercy. He reached a small clearing where he seemed to hear ancient footsteps. There, in his mind, Jesus taught not with words alone, but with actions. Christ touched lepers no one dared touch, ate with sinners everyone condemned, spoke with Samaritans society despised. Every gesture was a call to the impossible. There was no room for bitterness in a heart expanding under the love of the Son of God. The man realized understanding had never been his struggle. He knew the passage, knew the command, knew the doctrine. His struggle was surrender. Knowledge without obedience creates pride, but obedience without full understanding creates holy reverence. Perhaps that was what he needed. Not more explanation, but courage to let God rule even his deepest memories. Forgiveness suddenly resembled worship. Then it happened. A name surfaced within him, someone he thought he had already forgiven. The memory struck like lightning. His body tensed, breath caught, the old wound flared with fire. In that moment he understood that forgiveness is rarely a single act. 70 times 7 meant revisiting the wound until the poison was drained. Tears returned, unrestrained this time. They fell like water cleansing the valley floor beneath him. He confessed his resentment to God, something he had never dared to do honestly. The prayer held no elegance, only groans. And in that raw surrender, he realized forgiveness depended not on feeling willing, but on choosing obedience. Releasing resentment was more like loosening fingers around a stone too heavy to carry. He found a stone bench and sat. In that deep silence, he realized forgiveness didn't excuse injustice or pretend the pain was small. It placed the pain on God's altar. Forgiveness doesn't erase memory, it removes the venom. The memory remains, but its power dissolves. It no longer dictates his future or defines who he is. It was the beginning of freedom. The valley now seemed to speak. Every rock whispered that the Christian path is narrow because it passes through a cross. Forgiveness is a cross. It is dying to the instinct to strike back. It is burying the need to be right. It is letting God judge with perfect justice. For the first time he felt relief. What once felt impossible now seemed attainable through surrender. He remembered that forgiveness doesn't instantly restore relationships. Sometimes distance is wisdom. Boundaries can be holy, but no wound justifies a hardened heart. Forgiveness is vertical before it is horizontal. It takes place between a person and God before it reaches another person. Before heaven, he had been forgiven of infinite debt. How could he withhold pardon for small ones? Something changed in him. It was as if the Spirit lit a flame where ashes had settled. He stood with a new kind of strength, soft, surrendered, steady. Not triumph, but peace. Not victory, but release. Forgiveness became the doorway to live in the freedom he had long asked God for. He continued upward along a gentle incline. Light filtered through the trees above. With each step, he sensed old burdens falling away. Bitterness lost ground, pride dissolved, and Jesus' words grew louder. Not 7 times, but 70 times 7, a number without an end, a rhythm of grace, a daily surrender to love. At the summit, a gentle wind embraced him, as if God himself greeted him. He lifted his face, letting the breeze carry away the salt of his tears. For the first time in many years, he felt he carried nothing but God. Forgiveness had made him lighter, a traveler freed from sacks he was never meant to hold. There, he understood something greater. Forgiveness was not about the offender, it was about the disciple. Not about how many times someone failed, but how many times Christ's love restored him. The forgiveness he needed to offer was the forgiveness he lived by. Grace received must become grace revealed. He knelt on the dirt, raising his hands, surrendering names, wounds, injustices. There was no drama, only holy release. He felt unseen chains snap within his soul. Heaven did not open with visions, but it opened inside him. When he rose, he knew he would have to forgive again, maybe the same people, the same wounds, the same memories, but he now understood the call. 70 times 7 was the invitation to live as one transformed by grace, to reflect the King who cancelled his impossible debt, to turn a valley of pain into a path of freedom. If this story touched your heart, comment your favorite lesson below. When he finally left the valley behind, the man sensed he was no longer the same. The shadows that once chased him seemed to have lost their voice. He walked lighter, as if he had returned to heaven what he was never meant to carry. Jesus' words no longer sounded like an impossible demand, but a daily invitation into freedom. As he followed the new trail, he understood that forgiveness is not a destination but a journey. It does not end in one moment, but renews itself each time an old memory returns. 70 times 7 became a reminder that grace never runs dry, and that God never asks of us what he himself has not first given. The cross remained his compass. He knew difficult days would still come, that certain wounds might ache again, but he finally had a response. No longer resentment, but surrender. No longer calculation, but grace. His life now aligned itself with the heart of the King, who had forgiven him of everything. A new kind of courage grew in him, made of gentleness. Looking back, he saw the valley as a turning point, the place where he realized that his greatest enemy was not the one who hurt him, but the heart that refused to forgive. In admitting this, healing began. Releasing forgiveness became his weapon against darkness, his firm step out of an old slavery of the soul. This is how a true disciple is formed, and as he continued forward, he sensed heaven walking with him. Forgiveness had ceased to be a number and had become a way of life. 70 times 7 echoed within him like a quiet hymn, reminding him that true strength begins where the heart surrenders. And in that silence he finally understood. Forgiveness is the first miracle God performs inside us. If this story inspired you, share it with someone who needs hope.